Mhm. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexa Sevilla, and I will be your host for today's webinar, API Security Demystified. We are going to give folks just a few minutes to sign in. And if you are on, chat with us, let us know where you're coming in from. And if you're great at multitasking, also fill out the poll on what role you play at your company. So 2 requests, where you're coming in from, and then the role you play at your company. And we'll get started in about 5 minutes.
Do you have any more things we can make Zoom pop up in front of people's face? Like boom, 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 boom.
We should try.
Turns
Goal for
into a
next time.
1990s web browser.
Oh, so cool. And we got to get Clippy to kind of bounce through. Lasers. Got some ideas for the next one.
Pipes, screensaver.
Yes.
We'll probably get started right at like 5 after, let people filter in. If you're just joining us, we're about to get started. A couple minutes here. We'd love to check in with you and chat where you're enjoying your beautiful weather from this morning. We were having an entire weather discussion before we got on the air here. We'd also love to know what role you play at your organization so we can maybe cater the topic a little bit for you. But we'd love to hear from you in the chat or from you in the Q&A as we go through the webinar. If you have a question, we'd love to talk with you, chat with you, answer it. If you think what we're talking about is crazy, love to hear that. If you're just like, yeah, right on, what these guys are saying is super smart, we're not opposed to hearing that. Maybe, I don't know, Tim, are you opposed to hearing that?
I mean, no, when I do a webinar, that's all that I get.
That's all you get.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
okay.
don't know about you,
Wow.
Scott, but
I should do more webinars with you. I get a lot of like, dude, I don't know. Seems a little insane. Alexa, you said you're in Folsom and then Johnny Cat, you're not in prison, right?
No,
Okay.
not anymore.
I'm not anymore. Yeah, that my cell block was great. No, but close if you're,
Okay.
good old Folsom Prison Blues.
Fair enough.
Trying to mix up the weather conversation with maybe some music.
Yeah. Music and weather and then
Mhm.
jail
And then
cell.
facts about Folsom State Prison.
Yeah.
Yes, there is a t-shirt you can get at the gift shop at the prison that says Folsom's Bed and Breakfast.
How
So,
many prisons have gift shops? That's a fact I'd like to know.
I don't know, but I might research that later.
Have you tried to take a picture at the Folsom prison?
I have not.
Seems like a thing that's very well discouraged generally.
I drive past the entrance quite frequently.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'll take a picture. I'll send it to you.
Okay. Don't get in trouble.
I won't. All right, for those just joining, share where you're dialing in from, and there's a poll up. Let us know what role you play, and we're gonna kick this off in about a minute.
Got a good mix of people here, Tim. I don't know if you see that. Like
Yeah.
about half AppSec, half engineering, some leadership, and then
Oh no, I
other.
can't see the poll
Oh,
results,
you
can I?
can't see the pollers. Okay. I'm telling
So,
you.
no. I can only see the poll question that I can't answer because I'm a panelist. So
Oh, well, that seems inconvenient. However, as I see the live poll results happening on my side, about 40% AppSec, 30% engineering, 10% leadership, and 20% other.
very good. Wonder who those others are.
Mm. Straight competitors. We got cool places people dialing in from. Bahrain and Pretoria,
Oh yeah.
Boston. All right, Alexa, let's
All
rock.
right, let's kick it off. All right, well, thank you to our speakers, Scott and Tim. They're going to do intros in just a minute, but thank you all for attending API Security Demystified. During the presentation, if you have questions, comments, please use the webinar chat or the Q&A panel. We will follow up after the webinar with the recording and slides. And with that, I'll pass it over to Scott and Tim.
Awesome. Thanks, Alexa. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for API Security Demystified. We will do our best to remove the cloud of smoke around the mystery that is API security. There's no magicians today. Sorry. We're just going to
Yeah,
talk
that's
about
why it's
API security.
demystified. No
That's
magician.
right. So, quick agenda. What we're going to talk about, just do a little bit of intros, let Tim introduce himself. I'll talk about a little bit about myself very, very quickly because it's boring. We'll talk about the API security problem and why it's becoming a bigger and faster problem. We'll talk about what we think API security solution could be, should be, is. And then a little bit of best practices at the end. Q&A at the very, very last. And then we've got a ton of stuff for you to take home and hang up on your wall for medals and information and all kinds of fun stuff, or just read and then use later. If you have a question, I mentioned this before, if you have a question during the webinar, please ask in the chat or in the Q&A. We'd love to have an interactive session with you, figure out what you're struggling with, see if we can help, those kinds of things. Quickly, or maybe just first, not quickly, take as long as you want. Let's do some intros. Tim, tell the people who you are.
Sure, happy to. I'm Tim Erlin. I'm the VP of product at Wallarm, and I've got a lengthy history in cybersecurity at a couple of different companies, which are all actually one company through a couple of different acquisitions, if you want to look at it that way. And you can find me on LinkedIn and on Twitter, although decreasingly on Twitter these days.
For no other reason than it's just X.
Seems less useful than it used to be.
Yeah, fair enough. Awesome. Hi, everybody. I'm Scott Gerlach. I'm the CSO and co-founder at StackHawk. I was the CISO at SendGrid for about 3 years. So like my background is in actually running security teams. Was at GoDaddy for about 10 years doing tons and tons of different security stuff. I'm also a husband, dad, golfer, less brewer. If you want to buy a brewing system, let me know. Definitely a tinkerer. My ex Twitter handle is sgerlach, and then there's my LinkedIn down below. Now that we've done the intros, and I want to thank Tim for coming and joining us today because super interesting discussion. I think running through last week and the week before, I think we're going to have a good time here. But the very first thing we have to do is have yet another poll question. Poll question number 2. We're curious what brought you here today. If it's, I know I need API security, but I have no idea where to start. I currently have an API security monitoring solution, but I'm interested in a more proactive approach, or I currently test my APIs, but I'm interested in production monitoring and protection. And the poll results are coming in. Got about half that are, I don't know where to start, and half that are, I test APIs, but I need production monitoring and protection.
Oh, that's interesting results.
Yes, indeed. All right, let's talk about the API security problem. And this is a thing that is continuing to get bigger and faster, and hopefully we all know why. But let's talk about it a little bit. APIs are already the largest attack vector for a company, and it's growing fast. And the reason it's growing fast is APIs drive a ton of value. Like every company is turning into a software company, and you can think about that as, do you have a bank that you can't mobile bank at? That's an API. Do you ever go eat at a fast food restaurant and order online? That's an API. you go into a restaurant and order at a kiosk. That's an API. Like everything is getting driven by APIs. So API economy is driving a ton of value for customers and revenue growth for companies. So you can start seeing every single company in all kinds of different verticals beginning to or expanding their API footprint. And already 83% of traffic is API driven. So that's a huge, like all internet traffic. That's a huge percentage of what is driving stuff on the internet. And 64% of companies are already using AI generated code assistance. And that's growing to about 85%. So a majority of people who are writing software are already using AI code assistance. And that's enabling them to do their job 200% faster. They're twice as fast. So you can see this is becoming a huge problem, and our security teams are already struggling with what APIs do I have, what APIs are in production, who's talking to them, where are they being attacked, and securing them is becoming this really insurmountable problem and getting worse exponentially because of AI. And what that looks like is a little bit like this. So our increased release velocity is leading to more vulnerabilities and our familiarity with code as we use AI assistance. So people are using AI assistance more and they're getting code suggestions. And if it looks pretty good, we're using it because it's getting our job done, which makes us less familiar with the code just kind of overall. So you got release frequency increasing, those new vulnerabilities getting added because of the familiarity with the code gap, and that's just generating this huge risk. Tim, a little bit like, how do you think about this when you're talking
Yeah.
with your customers, or even, I know you're a product guy, so even in your product organization, how is this working?
Well, I think the statistics you had on the previous slide are dead on, right? That 83%, I mean, you just have to take a second to absorb what that is saying, that the vast majority of all of the internet traffic is made up of APIs. It is the largest attack surface. It just is, and it's continuing to grow. And with this graph, the piece that's important to me is the last point there, the lagging adoption of API security controls. So when you have rapid growth of technology like APIs, like AI assisted or AI generated code that's driving that API adoption, the security controls don't keep up, and that creates a gap that generates risk, real critical risk that organizations have to deal with. They don't have controls that they can put in place. They aren't putting in place the controls fast enough, and that's risk that has to be dealt with.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so poll question number 3. I swear to God, this is not in a poll question over and over and over and over again, but
Every
it
other
helps.
slide.
Yeah, every other slide is a poll question. It helps us frame up the conversation. So, poll question number 3, how confident are you in understanding of your API attack surface and its rate of change? And I think both of those things are really important. Like I understand what it looks like today and also how it's morphing and changing constantly, because that is in fact what's happening.
And Scott, while folks answer that question,
Yeah.
let's just talk for a second about, on the previous slide, we were talking about the lagging adoption of security controls.
Hmm.
Wallarm, because we're focused on monitoring, my perspective is, and blocking attacks, my perspective is focused on that, the rapid adoption of APIs, creating all of this attack surface that people can attack and we can block. But I think there's a corollary challenge there with how do you actually test all of those APIs that are being developed? That's just a
Yeah.
side of the velocity problem that I'm not as familiar with, but I think that's probably your perspective, right?
Yeah, it's a very similar problem, right? So when we talk about APIs with a lot of customers, and I think we're starting to see that in some of this poll response here, they're talking about like, I know about some of these assets in production, whether it's like the most important API or the most popular API or the thing that drives the most revenue. But what often doesn't happen is I know about the little thing that's a B2B endpoint or an internal API that is the admin panel or those kinds of things. And if I don't know about them, not only can I not monitor and protect them from attacks, but I don't know that I should be testing them.
Yeah,
So like it
exactly.
kind of leads to that, like, I test this one thing in production on a weekly basis, maybe. And I hope that that's like a really, really good spot. And that's kind of the same thing with monitoring, I think, is like, I know about this API, so I'm going to monitor it and protect it, but I don't necessarily know about the rest of the APIs that either are or are internet accessible or are internal or are
Mhm.
B2B.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, as you said, the poll question, the responses sort of, are indicative of exactly that challenge. You've got a relatively small percentage of folks who feel really confident about their API attack surface. You've got absolutely no one who is testing and monitoring more than 50% of their APIs, and then the largest chunk have either some coverage or just simply aren't sure at all.
Yeah. It's really, really good mix. And I think the poll results here are actually indicative of what we find when we talk to prospects and customers, right? The almost exactly thing happens when we talk to people and they go, I'm sitting with engineers. I know exactly what's going on. I've got this really cool spreadsheet of every repository and what it turns into in prod and where it is. And I know everything that's going on. It's really freaking hard, by the way.
Mhm.
Uh, and then the other answers are kind of like, I think, I don't know. I really don't know. Tim, you brought some cool charts. You want to talk through your charts?
Yeah, yeah, happy to. I always like to bring a little bit of real world data to the conversation. Um, Wallarm does this quarterly and then an annual API threat stats report. That's where this data comes from. So we look at every quarter all of the breaches, API related breaches that occurred, and then we look at all of the API related CVE vulnerabilities that were published in that quarter. And there's a lot more detail in the whole report, but these are kind of the two big picture items I wanted to bring here. So first of all, last quarter, Q3, there were significant API related breaches, right? 250, I think this adds up to 344 million impacted users. But you've got Deutsche Telekom, you've got this combination of Hotjar and Business Insider, some smaller organizations like Explore Talent and a Tollway Corporation, and then this, sort of, you know, um, Web3 company Fractal ID, all of which were victims of API related breaches. And if those are the anecdotes, the data is this increase in vulnerabilities. So we've tracked the API related vulnerabilities for the full 10 reports that we've done back since the start of 2022. But this is the quarter over quarter for Q3 number. So it's gone from 203 to 239. And then from last year to this year, from 239 to 469. So that's a 96% increase in the number of CVE vulnerabilities that are API related that are published in that Q3. So growing attack surface is really the message there, and an attack surface that attackers are leveraging.
Yeah. Why do you think that um, the number of attacks are becoming so much more frequent? Like just bulk number of attacks are becoming more frequent against APIs.
Yeah, there's some interesting. Well, I mean, I think we talked about it on the slide about the growth in the usage of APIs. Attackers follow the attack surface, right? I mean, they
Mm,
always do. And so as that attack surface has grown, attackers have followed it. Now, there are reasons that APIs are attractive for being attacked. If you're an attacker, why would I want to spend effort to write some kind of a web application parsing tool that interacts with that web app when I can go directly to an API that is designed to give data up? It's a much faster path to my objective as an attacker.
yeah. That was the answer I was trying to solicit from you. It's
Oh, good on.
go where the money is, take the easiest path.
Yeah.
So instead
See, we
of
didn't even have to practice that.
no, I
It
know.
was just there.
Hey, go where the money is, take the easiest path. So that's why when you talk about kind of threat actors and their behavior, people are a really fun place to start because that's usually a fairly easy attack surface because if you can trick a people, you can get them to do stuff. The next most valuable thing is that thing that handles all of the data that you're taking in or parsing back to customers and other business partners, and that's APIs right now. So
Yeah,
the huge risk is in the thing that takes in all that data and is designed to serve it back out
that's right.
and find the easiest path in that. And so that's why you see stuff like authentication flows and authorization issues and just broken kind of access control in the API is one of the biggest places that people take advantage of because it's the easiest thing to do. Like cross-site issues is in here on this Hotjar thing,
Yeah.
but it can be fairly tricky to develop that kind of an exploit. They're definitely looking for easier ways in first.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. Let's talk a little bit about the cost of fixing software bugs. So I like to show this particular chart here because I think it's a really good representation of the relative cost to fix bugs based on where you find them, right? So we're talking about kind of the wholearity of API security and protecting and monitoring in production as well as testing in pre-production. And where you really get a ton of benefits here, I think, is from testing and finding those bugs in pre-production while you're writing code before you push them into production so that it does a lot of good stuff like reduce the amount of alerts that are become alert fatigue, those kinds of things. And they become cheaper. Tim, I think you have a different take on this a little bit.
Well, there was people like to quote this in the security space. They like to quote this idea that it's less expensive to fix bugs, before production, pre-production, and they do that in part because a financial argument, if you're a vendor, makes a lot of sense, right? You want to make this financial argument, um, but I think there's an equally compelling argument here, which is not about cost; it's about risk, right? So, I just altered the slide a little bit, right? It's
Okay.
really the risk of security bugs, and that risk of exploit increases the closer the vulnerability gets to production. So you can talk about cost, and that's valuable. But what you're really aiming for is preventing that risk from being exploitable in production. And obviously, if you address it before it gets to production, you're much more likely or unlikely for that vulnerability to be exploited.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think our take is basically the same take because I know for sure that causing a software engineer to go back to code they haven't been in like today and the introduction of LLMs and the reduced code familiarity problem, it takes a cognitive resource more time to figure that out as automation is kind of the normal, right? It's easier and faster to get software to production. LLMs can help you solve these problems faster, and yet I've got to continue to interrupt software engineers. And the closer that gets to production, the more likely it is to be exploited, which causes even more problems when you have to stop production, have to shut down the product team to go fix an exploited issue, that kind of stuff. So I think our takes are both very, very similar. I
Yeah,
like I
different
like
different audiences, maybe,
yeah,
right?
I like
That's
your
yeah.
perspective on it, and I think it's absolutely true. I think both of those things are um, very valuable things to think about when you're talking about an API security solution. That is, can I prevent bugs from getting to production because that helps reduce risk and reduce the cost of rework, as well as if they do get there, can I prevent them from turning into a entire rework and a shutdown of production, which I have seen happen. You have probably seen happen. Uh,
Absolutely.
so I think that's good stuff. Um, more cool charts from Tim.
So another piece of the threat stats report is tracking the sort of top 10 attacks that we see coming across the Wallarm platform. And we compare this loosely to the OWASP API top 10. And in some ways we use it to argue with the OWASP API top 10. Uh, and what I really like about this particular chart is that it plots the prevalence of different attack types quarter by quarter over 2023 with sort of an annual ranking there. And you can see how things like injections, so SQL injection being the canonical example there, just sort of sit at the top. Injections continue to be an incredibly popular type of attack or prevalent type of attack, probably because they tend to work.
Mm-hmm.
Authentication flaws comes in number two. And then 3 and 4 are interesting. The cross-site issues did decline in popularity and prevalence over the course of the year and ended up at that number 3 spot. And then API leaks ended up at number 4. So any kind of things like tokens or credentials or sensitive data leaking from the APIs, sort of ended up in that number 4 spot. And then I won't read through all of them. I think, Scott, what you did here, which I thought was really interesting, was you marked off which of these are testable. So why don't you talk through what you had done there?
Yeah, totally. So I like that you brought up the OWASP API top 10, because when we were talking about this, we talk about it as not only are APIs susceptible to the OWASP API top 10 and the other stuff that's in this chart that isn't in that top 10, but also don't forget they're susceptible to the other OWASP top 10,
Sure.
which has to do with like some of them are the same, some of them are not the same. And the list, these are very specific to APIs. The list just keeps getting really, really big. But the thing that I thought was super interesting when we were looking at this chart and talking through it is, you were kind of talking through injections and authentication, and I was like, yep, that's testable. That's pretty testable if you understand how authentication is supposed to be working. Cross-site issues is testable. API leaks, if you know what you're looking for, that's super testable. So kind of the dark check mark is the can be automated, is very easy to test. The lighter check mark is the can be testable. There's work to do to be able to test it. And then the 1X is the one that's kind of hard to test, um, specifically StackHawk testing. But the other ones are either very easy to test or testable with a little bit of work. And so you can see this whole entire list that Tim brought is testable, maybe save one thing. And so if you think about what we just talked about with testing before you get to production, making sure that you're not introducing vulnerabilities, and then protecting against those vulnerabilities once you have APIs running in production on the internet, I think it builds a really good story about how to make sure that your organization is protecting against these top 10 kind of trends.
So this data is interesting, but it's always worthwhile to pull out a couple of specific anecdotes, right? Specific incidents that occurred as examples. So that's what we've done here, and there are lots more, of course. But you've got that Deutsche Telekom incident that showed up on a previous slide, where there were really authorization issues. This is an unauthenticated API endpoint that surfaced a couple 100 million user records. And then Hotjar and Business Insider was sort of a combination of client-side vulnerabilities. There's actually some cross-site scripting and OAuth management mismanagement here that combined to sort of create this particular set of incidents, if you will. And then I pulled out a Cisco incident that's a little bit older because it was a good example of a authentication bypass. Also one where there were multiple steps involved. So you could actually use some specially crafted HTTP requests to get a valid API token that you could then use via the API to, carry out your nefarious objectives, if you will. So that was really an authentication challenge.
Yeah.
So there are real incidents out there. Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
No, I was just going to say a couple caveats. We're talking about these kind of examples of incidents that are out there. I want to make sure that everyone is clear. We are not saying that StackHawk and or Wallarm and or both together could have prevented these incidents. I hate it when vendors do that. We're just kind of showing like how these things are correlated, right? We talked about the big chart that had all the incidents and then the kinds of incidents they were. So you can see if we look at this thing here, we've got authentication and authorization on the right-hand side in our injections, and we kind of color-coded how these kind of relate to those different things. So you can see the top, let's see, it's cross-site is number 1. No, sorry, cross-site was number 4, 5. Authorization's number 2, and authentication is number 5 or 6, something like that. So you can see how that like top 10 list turns into real incidents when you don't have really good controls or good process around your API security program. So I guess what we're talking about is how do we cover this whole entire DevOps loop? So everyone hopefully is familiar with the DevOps loop, and we kind of think about this as a dev centric kind of thing. Um, I'm going to talk about the left side. So kind of StackHawk's bread and butter is that left side where we're talking about testing. And usually the people that are responsible for writing code, building code, and testing code are your software engineers, QA, maybe less so now, that kind of group. And then Tim, if you want to talk about the other side.
Absolutely. So on the ops side, the key here is that you start to branch out into security. So there's this magical ideal that you maybe have DevOps or DevSecOps, and it's one organization that's tightly integrated, tightly coupled. What I tend to see is that as an organization grows, this cycle doesn't really change necessarily, but you have increased specialization where there are security folks, SecOps, who are responsible for more of that operation and monitoring. And that's where the other side of the tools come in. So if you think about sort of shift left, the corollary to that is shield right. So try and remove as much risk as you can in pre-production, and then monitor and mitigate and block for the risk that you couldn't remove or didn't know about.
Yeah, that's really good. That's typically where you find kind of SRE roles in the engineering kind of organization on the right side. And so SREs and kind of our security teams should be operating together. But today it's fairly broken. It doesn't look like this infinite loop that the DevOps loop is today in most organizations. Most of the time, what happens is our security teams who are operating on the right side are doing the operate monitor pieces, and they have no connection, knowledge, or understanding of what's going on the left side, and vice versa, right? The devs are out there like trying to build value, put valuable pieces of information and programs into production, and they might not know about the security team at all. Like I know they exist. I don't know what they do. They've got those cool ninja masks mostly, but I don't know what they do or where they work or who they are, and what that ends up looking like oftentimes is something like this. So you got kind of a broken DevOps loop, and in the middle is our favorite ticketing systems of all time. And the one that's often running the ticketing systems when we're talking about APIs are our AppSec teams. Our AppSec teams are kind of a go-between between the dev team and the operation, the SecOps team, and they're in tears because managing tickets and pushing tickets around and hoping people will fix tickets sucks. So
I can't help but point out that the more you automate that piece in the middle, the more the thing that's connecting these two sides of the loop are APIs.
that is true. The more automation you put into here, ticketing APIs, interface APIs, like again, more API problems.
They're
However,
everywhere.
however, the people that are managing this today are a little bit are struggling because there is a lot of tickets and there's a lot of code going out. So trying to manage that manually is really hard. So I think the thing that is really interesting to me, and I think Tim as well, is doing a better job of connecting these groups. How do we get the SecOps and dev teams to understand, more about each other, connect them better so that it's more efficient, and get rid of some of this like, well, I made a ticket and then someone will take care of the ticket and I'll go on with my next job.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about the API security solution that we think is super awesome. I think this one's you, right? Yep.
Yeah, so we wanted to talk about the stages, if you will, that are required for a comprehensive API security program. And you really have to start with discovery. There's no way, I mean, it seems trite, but you can't protect what you don't know about. If you don't know about the APIs that are out there, you can't test them, and you can't put appropriate protection in front of them. So building that inventory is a key starting point, right, Scott?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a key piece of the whole thing in both sides. Being able to go, I know what code is turning into APIs and also what APIs are actually running in prod and what they're doing, I think is super important to both sides of how discovery works and how it
Yeah.
facilitates the rest of kind of this flow. So I think discovery is like it is a well-known fact in security teams. Like asset discovery is a problem and is a thing. And I think there's a ton of really cool technologies out there that can help us do a great job at
Yep.
API discovery.
Well, I think you make an important point that discovery isn't just finding all the APIs that are deployed in production. It's more than that. You have to understand what you're building, where your code repositories are, what's in testing or in non-production. It's more comprehensive than just what's in production.
Yeah, and how it's changing, right? Like the interesting thing that we've seen from our API discovery tool is a repository gets built and it's empty for about 3 days. And then suddenly it's got an entire framework and a whole bunch of code that is, this is an API. And you know that that's going to turn into a thing that gets put into production.
Hmm.
And oftentimes we don't find out about it until it ends up as like a whole new section in Wallarm, right? Like, oh my God,
Hmm.
where did all these endpoints come from on this API? How did that get here? What is this supposed to be doing? We're freaking out. And then the same thing the other way, right? Being able
Yep.
to go, hey, we see that this API isn't operating as it's supposed to be in production, or it's getting hammered and there's a ton of traffic in it and people are attacking it and no one's working on it.
Yeah, you could go to the two extremes. You've got an API that sees lots of traffic and isn't in any of your specs, or you've got endpoints that are in your specs that don't see any traffic, and both of those are
Yeah,
potential problems, right?
both of those are super like huge problems.
Hmm.
But then we talk about when we get from discovery being able to test, and we've talked a little bit about blue in the face to about testing as we're building. The more information we can give, the more tooling and information we can give our engineering teams about being able to test, the more likely they are to just fix those problems, which is great. And then when we deploy them to production and in production environments, we want to protect them and be able to respond. And I think this is so when we chat about this, this is kind of the holistic piece of how an API security program works and stitching all this information together into an oversight of our API security program, I think is important. But these are the key pieces of you should be able to do this very well to have a holistic API security program.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Thoughts?
Absolutely.
Other
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think discovery testing and then protect the risks you can't remove, and then be able to respond to the incidents that actually occur with, meaningful details and response actions.
For sure. All right. I think it's time that we should ask some questions. No one's asking us questions. Let's ask them questions. Poll number 4. Where do you think the biggest gap in your organization in your API security program is? Discovery, testing, protection, response, something else we haven't thought about? Oh, someone says other right away. First answer, other. If you say other, I would love for you to put in the chat what
Comment.
you think it is.
Absolutely.
All right. More answers. Here we go. It's pretty well spread around here. API discovery, API security testing, API response are all about even. Protection has the is the low answer here. 10 of 23 have responded. Okay,
That's interesting.
the other 13 of you, all you got to do is push a radio button and then hit submit. Let's let's get like 18 responses in here.
What's interesting to me about this is that in one of the previous polls, which one was it that we did?
I think it was
Uh,
number 2. No, yeah, number 2.
Number two. Yeah, the one that the I have an API monitoring solution was the lowest
Mm-hmm.
here, but here we're seeing API protection, which I would associate with API monitoring solutions. Like that's the pair is the lowest,
Yeah, I think
which is interesting.
I think people think about them sometimes as different products. Like if I say API monitoring to an engineer, they would say something like Datadog or something that's like an APM,
I
application
was
performance monitoring.
I was going to assume that they were listening to us when we talked, and they realized that you have to start with API discovery,
I mean, that
and
could be.
that's why it's at the top. But I do appreciate that API discovery is at the top. That does make sense from what we've seen
Yeah.
in the customer base
Say,
in the market.
same with me. Like we've seen that pretty good mix of like I have a thing that is monitoring and protecting us in production, but I don't know if we're doing all of the things.
Hmm.
Awesome. So let's talk about where in our sweet little flow chart we kind of specialize, and this may be self-evident from the last slide and how we talked about it, but quickly, I think the Wallarm and StackHawk discovery bits are really important, and we talked about them.
Yeah,
Obviously, StackHawk does test very well. Wallarm is probably best in class in protect and respond, and specifically block, because I know there's a ton of
absolutely.
things out there that don't do block, which is if you don't do block, you're not doing respond. Otherwise,
Well,
you're doing
there's a reason it says protect and not detect, right? Because
yes,
detecting attacks doesn't solve a problem for you. You need to be able to block those attacks. I think that's a key component of protection.
yes. Detecting attacks makes more tickets in the middle.
It does. It does.
So,
Yeah.
I super appreciate this, and then we'll get to this in best practices here shortly. Um, but Tim, talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about Wallarm, would you?
Yeah, let me add a little bit of color here in terms of what Wallarm does. So we're focused on, as Scott mentioned, we're focused on detecting and blocking attacks, and there are a few other things that we do in order to help us with that mission. We do API discovery, and we do some risk assessment of those APIs. We detect and block both sort of stateless attacks, things like SQL injection or cross-site scripting that you can kind of detect in a single request, but also API abuse and API bots, so things that require a little bit more sophistication, monitoring an entire session as well. And there are lots of different ways to deploy Wallarm. One of the key differentiators for us is that we want to make sure we work in your environment. If we're going to be a tool that actually blocks attacks, we need to be able to deploy in all the different ways that are necessary in order to do that. So those are kind of the key components for Wallarm and what we're really focused on. Support lots of different protocols. That's the other piece that comes up frequently. So if you're using things like gRPC or GraphQL, we can support those in addition to REST and SOAP and WebSockets and things like that.
Yes. This is one of my favorite things about us working with Wallarm is the list of APIs that they can monitor and protect is the same list that we can test, which is
Yes,
so awesome.
and the thing that we don't do is test. Imagine that.
Crazy. Thanks, Tim. I super appreciate that. If you have questions about what Wallarm does or does not do, please put them in the chat. We'd be happy to answer those or in the Q&A. A little bit about StackHawk. StackHawk is the only proactive API security solution out there. The ability to discover your API attack surface. So what code is turning into APIs so that I can make sure I'm testing and monitoring that API when it gets to production. Empowering developers to fix those API vulnerabilities so we're not playing ticket hockey, ticket hot potato, hot poticket. I made that word up.
You're gonna have to workshop that one a little more.
I like it. It's hot poticket. I think it's good. Uh, it could be bad. I don't know. Testing those APIs for vulnerabilities prior to production, and then giving security teams oversight into and governance into that testing cadence. So as repositories are turning into APIs, are we testing them, and do I have monitoring deployed on those APIs when they get to production? So do I have a Wallarm out there watching traffic, protecting me from attacks that we either didn't detect because they're complicated, like Tim was mentioning, session-based attacks that are like you have to go here and then here and then here and then here. PS, if you find one of those things, turn that into a test so that you can test and make sure it doesn't happen in the future. But those are the kinds of things that StackHawk does. Tim, let's put on our imaginary hats, our thinky hats. Let's give people a way to imagine a world where they know where their APIs are deployed, uh, I know what APIs are deployed, where they're deployed, when they're deployed. I know who is responsible for those APIs, who writes the code for those APIs. And I know that new APIs are about to be introduced into production before they're released.
Mhm.
And I've also tested them.
And shockingly, that's a combination of the Wallarm and StackHawk capabilities, right? The discovery in production, the discovery in code in repositories, and then the testing, and then of course, from the Wallarm side, that ability to actually block attacks in real time and to block API abuse in real time, not just detect, not just create more tickets and play hot ticket.
Hot put ticket. He did it.
I can't do it.
See,
It doesn't
it's
fit.
so good. You did
Uh,
it.
and being able to respond to those threats, of course, is important too.
The last piece here is the super imagine a world. And I like to think about this as attack to code or code to attack to code, however you want to write that. But taking the intelligence that you're learning from Wallarm about what's happening in prod, what's getting attacked, how it's getting attacked, and turning that back into information that the engineers can use to test and make sure that that doesn't turn into an incident later on down the road. Take that real life attack back to the vulnerable piece of code and the team that owns it and fix it and reduce the reoccurrence of these vulnerabilities and really create efficiency around fixing because those teams are now more connected. The data is more connected in what's happening and what we're building and what we're testing for. I think that's the really cool part about how these products can work together.
I agree. I agree. And it just makes perfect sense to combine the two, and deliver that complete cycle for API security.
Okay. Let's again, if you have questions, chat, Q&A. We're going to give you some QR codes. I promise they're not phishing attacks. They're not mobile iOS attacks. I don't got time for that shenanigans. These are links that get you to the StackHawk trial and the Wallarm trial so you can test these products out yourself, put them together, see how they can augment or improve or start your API security program and what this kind of entire picture looks like. Um, any other thoughts about that, Tim?
Yeah, no, I mean that's the key. The proof is in the pudding, so to speak. You can actually try both products, and try the integration between them, and see how it works for yourself.
Yep. All right. We're going to leave this slide up. When now is the actual official time for questions. If you have a question, please make sure to drop it in the chat or the Q&A. I haven't seen anybody say anything the whole entire time, and it makes me sad. Alexa, questions? Do you have a question?
I mean, the spelling of hot ticket, potato
Hot
ticket.
hot put
How
ticket.
do we hashtag that?
Hot put ticket.
Hot ticket.
That would be an interesting trend to see.
Hot put ticket is trending on all of the socials. Where the hell did that come from?
Let's make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Maybe no questions. So I think the last piece here is thank you. So I definitely want to thank Tim for joining me on this journey of presenting how API security should work. Hopefully we've helped you understand what things are out there, what a whole entire program looks like, and giving you some ideas on where to go. Also, thanks to Alexa for giving us an intro and a lead in, and also continuing to push my hot ticket agenda.
And Scott, we do have a question that just
Oh,
came
yes.
in.
Great.
The best way to get questions is to try and wrap up the webinar.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So Tim wanted to ask how you debug in production if you cannot discover the API. It's in the chat too. Um, I'm not
How
sure,
do you
Tim, if I've
debug in
answered that.
production if you can't discover the API? I mean, I think the answer is you can't, but maybe you understand that differently, Tim.
Yeah, I'm just looking at it. So, I could interpret it a couple of different ways. So if he's asking how Well, let's talk a little bit about the integration between StackHawk and Wallarm and see if we can
Yep.
clear that up, right? So what Wallarm does is looks at traffic, so as traffic passes through the Wallarm platform, we look at that traffic, we analyze it, we use it for both API discovery and attack detection. So we'll discover all of the APIs and endpoints and a bunch of information about them. And then we can use that information to produce an open API specification from the discovered traffic. And that specification can be used by StackHawk for testing. And then on the StackHawk side, Scott, you've got a discovery mechanism that looks at code repositories, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So we've got a discovery mechanism that looks at code repositories and says, hey, this code repository turns into an API. And so the two things that can happen there are, if that code is already making an open API spec, there's a really cool thing you can do where it's like compare these open API specs. And by compare, I mean use one to test StackHawk and use the Wallarm generated one to test StackHawk and see how they're different and what things show up that are different. When they are the same, the results are the same, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
However, sometimes what is defined in an open API spec that comes from either the code or hand rolling, God, please don't hand roll open API specs, is that they operate differently than what actually happens in production. So that's a really good thing to see.
If you have specs that you're generating as part of your development process, you can use those for testing with StackHawk, but then you could also load them into Wallarm and it will compare what it sees in the production traffic and identify things for you like, shadow endpoints that don't exist in the specification, but for which there's traffic, or orphan endpoints, endpoints that are in the specification that nobody's using. So you have that comparison mechanism too.
I think you guys released a new feature that's super cool, which is open API spec enforcement.
Yeah, that's true. You can actually just choose to enforce the spec as well. So if you want to block, any request that is missing a required parameter or has a parameter of the wrong type, things like that, you can do that as well. That's right.
Besides open API spec, do both platforms support RAML? I'm gonna be real honest. I'm not sure I know what RAML is.
I don't either.
Good.
Which is going to be a no.
No, I don't feel bad.
RESTful API modeling language. No.
Oh, I have heard of RAML. I think there's a pretty quick and automatic way to go from RAML to open API spec. I think that's pretty well defined. I've seen this like once or twice before. We don't support RAML out of the box. We haven't run into it very often, which is obvious when I go, what? But I'm pretty sure that when I've dug into this before, there's a pretty easy way to go from RAML to OS, open API spec. Good questions.
Yeah, appreciate the questions.
Alexa is putting into the chat, and you will also get this in an email along with our video and the slide deck and all kinds of stuff. The blog posts that are on both of our sites about how these things work together, as well as the data sheet on what that integration looks like today and how you can use it in your environment. So you can check them both out on either the StackHawk side or the Wallarm side in case you get lost. And again, if you don't get them today, we'll send them to you in an email later. You can always look them up later on when you're hanging out with your friends going, I saw this really cool webinar, and that's why I say hop a ticket all the time. However, they also gave me all this great information about about API security.
Yeah, that's a wrap.
All right.
I think
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you both, Scott and Tim. Thanks everyone for attending. Keep an eye on your inbox for follow-up from us and enjoy the rest of your day.